A very good morning to one and all. Welcome to the largest gathering of open source enthusiasts and IT professionals in India. Welcome to Open Source India 2021. In the next couple of days, you will witness engaging talks and panel discussions on latest technologies targeted towards developers, DevOps engineers, database managers, IT managers, and enthusiasts. Add to that, you can also explore latest tech solutions from IT giants, including Microsoft, AWS, and Google, by visiting the virtual expo as part of the Open Source India, being powered by the Tech World Congress platform, of course. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge our esteemed sponsors, including Microsoft, Soda Foundation, Google, Amazon Web Services, MySQL, Huawei, iText, GitHub, SUSE, and Entrepreneur First India, and Ensemble Labs. Their support is what makes the event possible. And please don't miss to participate and check out our spatial hall for quizzes and contests at the exposition. We hope the next 2 days will be useful, insightful, and enlightening for you. So sit tight and enjoy the show. The first day and the first keynote, titled Lessons Learned Scaling Kubernetes. Joining us is Brendan Burns, Corporate Vice President with Microsoft. I'm sure this session and the learnings that Brendan is about to share will help you scale your open source project. Without further delay, I would like to hand over this session to Brandon and request all of you to post your questions in the Q&A box located on the right-hand side of your windows.
Folks, welcome to the Open Source India event. I'm Brendan Burns, CVP of Open Source and Cloud Native at Microsoft Azure and a co-founder of the Kubernetes project. And I'm really excited to have this chance to talk to you today. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about open source at Microsoft. And frankly, that's the thing that drew me to Azure in the first place, was the real opportunity to combine a hyperscale public cloud with a deep dedication to open source software up and down the stack. I think the truth is that when we think about innovation, today in the cloud, open source is the way that innovation happens. So when you look at our teams building things like Cosmos DB within our India Development Center, they're doing and implementing the open front end APIs into the Cosmos DB NoSQL store so that our customers can have access to a best-in-breed, cloud-native, worldwide, reliable storage interface, but with open APIs. With open APIs that mean that they can communicate in the exact same protocols they'd expect to use on-premise when they're talking to Cosmos DB in the cloud. And our teams are working with those open source projects and with those open APIs in order to make that a reality. And really, that is the power of open source, right? It's our ability to deliver to a customer an API that gives them the confidence to trust us with the knowledge that they can run those APIs everywhere. And I think the reason, as we've seen infrastructure move from running on individual desktops to running around the world everywhere, where applications need to be portable, the skills of your teams need to be portable, I think that's why we've seen the corresponding rise of open source, because it really is the power that unlocks ecosystems and communities to do more together. And I wanted to talk about how we bridge from developing products that implement open APIs through to how we actually develop our own open source projects within Azure. So for example, we really think a lot about innovation. Azure is nothing if we cannot create new things, new ideas for our customers. And today, a ton of the innovation that Azure is doing is happening out in the open source. A great example of how this innovation is happening out in the open source is the Dapper project. You can find out more about Dapper at dapper.io or up on GitHub at github.com/dapper/dapper. But Dapper is a distributed application programming runtime for Kubernetes. The truth is that when I started the Kubernetes project, we were really focused on trying to democratize distributed systems. Now we're many years in, and I think unfortunately we've made a lot less progress towards that goal than I could have hoped that we would have. I think Dapper is starting to change that. Dapper is starting to say, hey, we're not just going to build things that help people deploy applications easier. We're not just going to build infrastructure in Kubernetes that makes it easier to keep an application reliable. We're actually going to start thinking about what are the ideas that we need to build in order to make the actual act of programming an application more reliable, more secure, and in fact, more accessible to a variety of different people around the world. Right? And I think especially in these days, as we start seeing some of the challenges around software supply chain, some of the challenges around dependency management, a tool like Dapper that takes, provides a simplified interface to a variety of different eventing systems, storage systems, and all kinds of different cloud-based or on-premise infrastructure, abstracts it away from the developer and allows them to focus on getting their application done, is a great example of innovation that we need, and innovation that could only happen out in the open. Because if we came and we said, hey, look, we're going to build all these awesome APIs, but the only way you can access them is from within Azure, I think a lot of people would say that's fantastic, but thanks, but no thanks. I need to be on premise. I need to be in private cloud. I even need to be in another public cloud. It's only when we build open source APIs and open source projects where the entirety of the industry can come together that we can truly be successful and change the way that people are building applications. So I think Dapper's a great example both of how we lead with innovation, but also how open source makes things possible that weren't possible before. But of course, it's not just about creating new projects. We think about how we also help expand existing communities. And so when we look at the Kubernetes community, it's a mature, very large open source community. And when Azure engages there, we're really focused on finding the places where we can simultaneously move Kubernetes forward and also help our customers in the process. And I think a great example of this is the work that we've done with IPv4 and IPv6 dual stack support in Kubernetes. This effort has been led primarily by an engineer on one of my teams. He has, managed to build community support around this, become one of the recognized figures in networking in the Kubernetes community. And, at the end of the day, this has moved the state of networking forward within Kubernetes for every single Kubernetes user, whether they're an Azure customer or not. But it has also made lives easier for our Azure customers who are using IoT devices that might be connected to an IPv6 network and only have an IPv6 address. It's made life easier for our telecommunications partners who are thinking about how they build next generation 5G networks and beyond and require the space that IPv6 supplies, but at the same time cannot move into IPv6 exclusively and need IPv4 control planes or other access points to be working as well. And so this work to bring dual stack support to Kubernetes is a fantastic example of how we can both help a community move forward, but also help our customers in the process. That's a beautiful thing, when our interests both as a company and as community members coincide in a single solution. And then I think the final piece that's so important in open source work is thinking about how do we actually do the hard work that keeps these communities moving. Right? It's great that we do work that benefits our customers, but sometimes we just need to do the work that creates a positive and useful and well-functioning community. And that's why I've been especially proud of the people in the Azure team who've managed to, win the Chop Wood and Carry Water awards presented by the Kubernetes community at KubeCon each year. These people represent the very best of how we can contribute to open source by taking on the thankless tasks like being a release manager, or helping in the community, helping ensure that people are treated with respect and integrity, doing all of the hard work behind the scenes that keeps Kubernetes moving forward. Being recognized in this, I think, is one of the best things that demonstrates Azure's commitment and Microsoft's commitment, not just to developing our own open source projects, not just to contributing code that helps the community and helps our users, but actually really focusing on that ecosystem and building viable open communities that frankly move the entire technology world forward. All right, so hopefully that is a brief introduction to the things that we think about when we're thinking about open source within Microsoft. But of course, I want to talk a lot about open source in general and make sure that every single person, whether you're an Azure customer now or whether hopefully you'll be an Azure customer in the future, can have a great open experience. And in that light, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about lessons learned in scaling Kubernetes. I have to say, when I'm thinking about giving talks like this, and when people have asked me to give talks like this, it makes me a little bit nervous, right? It wasn't too long ago that I was sitting in your shoes watching, sort of open source luminaries give talks, thinking about, you know, what it might be like to create a project like this. And at the same time, when we started creating Kubernetes, one of the things that I learned is it's very easy to provide advice. It's very hard to walk the path. And so whenever I'm asked to, give one of these talks where I'm summing up the experience that we've learned, I always like to just add a warning at the beginning, I guess, which is to say, this is what I thought worked well for us at the time. I hope it's useful. I hope it's interesting. I wouldn't take it as gospel. Definitely don't just follow it and take it as the rules. But hopefully it's a jumping off point to learn about how to build and scale open source communities. I wanted to start with a little bit about my personal prehistory in open source. Kubernetes is not the very first open source project that I've been involved in. I think I started, like many people do, with being a consumer of an open source project. In my particular case, it was a project called NetBSD. NetBSD is a Unix variant that still is available out there. The reason it was interesting to me is it was one of the most portable Unix variants there are. I had a really old Macintosh that I had collected out of the dustbin of an old computer lab, and I really wanted to run Unix on it. Linux didn't run on it, FreeBSD didn't run on it, but NetBSD did. And so I got involved in the NetBSD community trying to make Unix work on this specific old Macintosh. And through that community, I got connected effectively to these people on these mailing lists who were helping each other for no other reason than because they wanted to see them be successful. And that experience of tapping into this community of people who are tinkering in the same areas as I was, who maybe actually had the same weird old computer that I had, it was just so nice to connect to those people and to that community and feel like, a part of something. Taking a few steps forward, as I started to become more of a developer, I actually had the opportunity to step in and maintain some open source software. And on that side, being a maintainer of a pre-existing project, I got to see, sort of the other side, which is the recipient of all the questions, all of the bugs, all of the people who come to you and ask you to fix their problem. And while it puts a lot of demands on you, it's also a really fantastic experience to know that you are building something that's useful for people and that you are the one who's helping them get their jobs done. That sort of ability to touch people's lives and impact them and empower them was something that I still find compelling to this day. And again, in these open communities, it's so fantastic because it's really it's a different kind of thing than when you work for sort of a faceless mega corporation. I think these open source communities have a familiarity and a friendliness that is just different, which is really fantastic. And then finally, later on, I had the opportunity to actually create some open source projects that started gaining some traction. And in doing that, I found that the sort of pride in creation of an open source project, and I think I probably learned the most. But I think a lot of the lessons that I took from my prehistory, both as a user and a maintainer, really helped influence and inform what we did with Kubernetes going forward. When I talk about the lessons we learned from scaling Kubernetes, I really think that there are 4 major areas. The first is the beginning of an open source project. What do you need to know in order to do a good job creating the enthusiasm that will sustain an open source project? The next stage was what I would call the rocket ship, and it's where a lot of people hope to attain, where you've generated a ton of enthusiasm, and suddenly the entire world is pouring into your project. How do you do it? How do you scale? How do you create a viable community? And then after the rocket ship comes maturity. Where the project is actually starting to be fully adopted. It's being used in production. New features and new adoption are perhaps less valuable than ensuring tranquility. And then finally, on a personal note, I want to talk about moving on and how you make a decision to leave a community or to step back from a community that you've been sort of very intimately involved in for a time period. So let's start at the beginning. And I think that when you're starting out, there's a bunch of really important lessons that you need to know to carry yourself down the road towards a successful open source project. I think the most important thing that you need to know when you're getting started is, what is your project? It may sound obvious, I guess, but it really is critically important for you to have a sense of both what you are and then also what you're not. Right? I think that early on in a project, it's very, very tempting to add new features that somebody asks for. It's very, very tempting to try and spread from one area of success to another area of success. But having some focus, really knowing you and why you're doing this, and also why you're open sourcing this, is a critically important part of how you construct your community, right? If you're just kind of putting your open source out there like it's Instagram, like it's social media, so that other people can see the code that you wrote, it's fantastic. But it's important that you understand that you're doing that, because you're never going to build a community that way. You know, and that's okay. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing, right? It's great to share code just to share, just to show. But if you want to build a community, and that's an important thing and an important part, and you want to build a long-lived project, it's really important to know that going in, because it's going to change how you approach things. You're going to have to be more responsive. You're going to have to, be more careful about curating the people who join into the community. It's really critical that you understand, why are you taking this step of putting that code out onto GitHub or wherever you're trying to host your open project. I think it's also really critical, especially in the early stages, to understand your goals and your metrics. Right? How are you measuring, whether you're being successful or not? Right? It's very easy in the early days to just kind of do stuff without any focus. Right? And again, like if you're just having fun and you're just sharing what's out there, that's great. I don't want to suggest that every single project has to be built as if it's going to succeed like the Kubernetes project did. There's lots of little projects that I've put out on GitHub, mostly just because I wrote some code, I thought it was useful, and I hope somebody else might find it in the search engine someday. But if you want to create a successful, long-lived open source project, it's really critical that that you understand how to measure that success, right? And I think especially early on, some of the most important metrics that you're thinking about are things like responsiveness, things like making sure that your PR queue is low, things like making sure that your issue queue is low, right? Things like figuring out how engaged people are with your project. Because the truth of the matter is that when you start thinking about open source projects, this is really the way that the world looks, right? There's a billion different open source projects out there, right? And there's a limited number of contributors. There's a limited number of people who could be part of your community. We don't have enough hours in the day to be part of every community. We don't have enough interest or time or keyboard time on keyboard to contribute to every single community that's out there. And so especially early on when you're creating a project, you have to realize that you're in a competitive landscape, and that every person who's a potential contributor to your project is also a potential contributor to 10 or 15 other projects. And if you're not really mindful of that, if you're not really, your getting started experience isn't really clean and really tight, you don't show that you care by paying attention to the issue queue and being responsive and merging people's PRs, they're just going to move on. Okay? And I think we tend to get a little bit myopically focused sometimes and just be thinking about our project and not be thinking about the broader ecosystem of projects that are out there. But especially early on in the Kubernetes project, we were really, really clear about the fact that we were in a competitive landscape. There were like 8 or 9 other potential container orchestrators out there on GitHub that were all vying to be the container orchestrator of choice. And I think it was a lot of our early decisions to make sure that we had a really tight getting started experience, so that in an hour or even less, someone could sort of try something out with Kubernetes, get a flavor for it, that we started doing releases really early so that there was a stable binary that we knew worked, that was tested, that would that would actually work when you downloaded it and tried to run it, that we assigned an engineer to pay attention to issues, to pay attention to our IRC channels, to go look in Stack Overflow for questions. All of these things paid dividends in keeping contributors in our project and not having their eyes wander out there to other projects. And I think that really comes down to this notion of looking alive, right? One of the things I did early on is I took all of our CI/CD systems, all of our tests that we were running in an automated fashion, and I made them chat into our IRC channel. IRC is like a low-tech version of Slack for those of you who haven't actually used IRC in the pre-Slack days, internet relay chat. And the thing is, it was because, when we went onto our IRC channel, it was really quiet. It was kind of like a ghost town, and, I think people detect that. I mean, when I see an open source project and I'm thinking about helping with it, one of the very first things that I do is I go and I scan down, when was the most recent commit? And let me tell you, if the most recent commit was 2 weeks ago, was 3 weeks ago, was a couple months ago, I'm going to move on because that project's not alive. That project's not vibrant, right? And so even if you're small, if you want to become big, it's incredibly important that you show signs of life, right? Can keep contributing code to it, keep the issue queue low, make sure that when somebody drives by, and you never know when somebody's going to drive by, it looks like somebody's there. I mean, this is like how we go to restaurants, right? You walk by a restaurant, you look in the restaurant, lots of people, active, happy, energetic, you're going in. You go by a same restaurant, same menu, same, decor, all that, empty, totally dead empty on a Saturday night. You think, why is nobody there? I think I'll keep on going, right? And it may seem superficial, and it is at some level, but it's critically important to understand that in this competitive landscape, people are judging you by how fresh and how alive and how responsive you appear. I think this is another really important and incredibly underappreciated thing, right? Which is to build welcoming and inclusive communities. I think this is an area where we really, really focused on in the Kubernetes community, and it has continued to pay dividends for us, right? I think that one of the things that you don't realize is there are these pieces where small changes in trajectory early on make really big changes in outcome. You can think of this as sort of like the equivalent of, the launch angle of a rocket or the launch angle of a cannonball, right? Very small changes in directory, 1 or 2 degrees change in trajectory, make a very big difference in where things land. And I think from the beginning, we had a really strong focus on building a community that was welcoming, that treated every single newcomer to that community like they had value, like they had valuable things to say. And frankly speaking, it's hard sometimes, because sometimes people come into your community and they don't behave in a respectful way. And you have to take them along, and you have to take them aside, and you have to tell people, like, this is not how we behave in this community. This may be how you behaved in a different community, but this is not how we behave in this community. And a lot of those conversations are really challenging ones, but they're essential ones to have, because especially in the early days of creating a project, the culture that you set is the culture that you're going to live with for the rest of the project. So there are some things you can change over time. There's a lot of things like culture that are very hard to change once they've become ingrained in the early founders of a project. And I think this is, again, a huge part of our later success, was the foundation that we built at the very beginning. And then I think the last piece, and this is obvious, but it's a competitive landscape in terms of technology too. And in the early days of launching your project, you're going to have to be very, very fast. This may mean working harder than you necessarily could do at a steady state. The early stages of a project are a sprint. And while things like work-life balance are extremely important, there are times when the opportunity cost of delay is not worth the extra hour of sleep or the extra hour of video that you might be watching. You absolutely need to be quick on your feet, be responsive to the competitive landscape, be adding features, be fixing bugs. Absolutely make sure that people believe that there's a future to the project, because the people who come into the project at the beginning, they're not betting on what you have today. They're betting on your ability to reach where they think you're going to go. All right, so hopefully that gives you a sense for the lessons that we learned in the very beginning of creating the Kubernetes project. The next part of this is the rocket ship. Right. There's my illustration of the rocket ship. This is the part where, to be honest, not every open source project is going to get there. But I think every, or at least a lot of open source projects want to get there. And perhaps more importantly, I think there's a lot of lessons in that upward hockey stick scale that are applicable to your project, no matter what size it actually ends up being. I brushed on this. I started out at the beginning by saying you needed to know yourself. I think as you start to scale up, it stops being necessarily about knowing yourself, and it starts being about knowing your user. Right? So suddenly when you're in the hockey stick phase, in the explosive growth phase, you suddenly have a lot of people coming and asking for things. You suddenly have a lot of people filing bugs, you have a lot of people asking for features, you have a lot of people asking for help or to help. And I think what is going to sustain you through this period and ensure that you don't go running off in a billion different directions is having a really crisp understanding of what most people who are using your project need and want. Because it's very tempting to do, to merge the PR that someone just sent, and it's very tempting to try and fix the issue that someone just filed. And that's good, I would say, to do early on in your project, because responsiveness is more important than consistency at some level. But when you've hit that scale hockey stick and you're attracting people faster than you know what to do with, it's the volume of noise that is produced around the project is going to become almost deafening. And in that moment, you need to prevent yourself from growing too wide. You need to focus on growing strongly in the area that delivers most value to most of the people who want to use your project. And the best way to do that is to really understand who your users are, what do they need, and what are they looking for you to solve. I think, again, getting back to the goals and metrics, I am very data driven. I think in this hockey stick phase, what you're really looking for is measuring adoption, because there's nothing worse than starting up the hockey stick and stalling out, seeing the potential, and then suddenly having something happen. Maybe you release a couple of bad releases, maybe you stop merging some PRs, whatever it happens to be, and your adoption starts slowing too early. But I think also measuring things like, are you attracting contributors, right? Because in this hockey stick, you have to be starting to scale. And if it's just you reviewing the PRs, if it's just you fixing the issues, you're not going to scale, right? So you have to be keeping track of, am I attracting contributors? Are they moving up? Am I getting more than just one-off PRs that do bug fixes? Am I getting broader proposals? Am I getting bigger PRs? Do I believe that my community is moving towards a world where it's sustainable? And so rather than, early days where you're really tracking things like responsiveness, how quickly do you get on an issue, how quickly do you turn around on a PR, I think in the sort of hockey stick growth phase, what you're really tracking is, am I headed towards a scalable community? Am I, and then I think also as part of that, and we'll talk a little bit about more infrastructure later on, but also like, are my tests not flaky? Do I have enough test coverage? You're starting to have to turn the crank on the things that will actually make you a sustainable project going forward. I mentioned earlier here, I'm in the way of hurting the cats. I'll duck down. There you go. I think the thing that happens at scale is more people show up. And with more people is going to be more opinions about where you should go, more personalities, more different, companies even with different agendas. And the beautiful thing about open source, I talked about this at the very beginning, the beautiful thing about open source is that it attracts people from a variety of different backgrounds. The beautiful thing about open source is it brings together a bunch of people from potentially competitive companies that are competing with one another. But the challenge that is brought with that, the challenge that comes from that, is that you as the leader in the project have to herd the cats. You have to keep all of these different voices, all of these different agendas headed roughly in the same direction. It's easy to do when there are 5 of you, and especially easy to do when there are 5 of you who've come together around a shared vision. In the hockey stick rocket ship phase, people are going to come to you simply because of your success. They won't necessarily buy into your vision. They won't necessarily share your agenda, but they see the success and they want a part of that success. And if you're not careful, they'll pull you off in so many different directions that the project will lose its sense of identity and lose its sense of core. I mentioned earlier the needs of scaling, and I talked about it in terms of attracting contributors and in terms of getting your tests into the right place. But this is also a really important time when you need to start thinking about, like, is my software actually designed for scaling? Right? And scaling here both means, like, is it designed so that when somebody suddenly runs it 10 times bigger than somebody's ever run it before, is it going to work, or does it fall apart? But I think more importantly, is my software designed for scale in terms of humans? Is it modularized enough so that I can assign a tech lead to a certain area and they can own that area of the source code without having to make deep changes in every other piece of the source code? Do I have the right interfaces in place so that I can isolate different components from one another, potentially even replace one component with a different implementation if that's the net thing that is necessary to do going forward? Right. I think at the beginning stages, everybody knows the entire software code base. As you start hitting this rocket ship, you're starting to approach a world where nobody can know the entire code base. And it's incredibly important that you've built it in such a way that it scales to hit the needs of this growing community. I think this is one of the most important lessons. Sometimes when we talk about Kubernetes, people say, what are the things that you wish you had done right and that you messed up? I think that one of the things that we really didn't do a great job of early on is formalizing things. And I think in some sense it's natural, because when you start this project, it's an organic coming together of a few people around a shared idea. You don't need to write down anything about formal proposals, or in fact, all of that stuff gets in the way of all of that speed and agility that I mentioned earlier. But much like scaling your software, when you hit this ramp up, you have to scale your process. Right? And you have to realize that many people are coming to your project who have not been in your project before, who have not been there for the 2, 3, however many years or of discussions, of understandings, of building that came before them. And if you have no record of your decisions, if you have no written down structure for how we decide things, the people who come into the project, you're either going to have to spend a lot of time explaining stuff to them, or they're just not going to understand. And I think a great example of this is the KEP process, or Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal process. It's a formalism in the Kubernetes community around declaring and proposing new features. And I have to tell you that when it was initially proposed, I hated it. I absolutely straight up hated it. I thought it was bureaucratic. I thought it was bloated. I thought it was slow. It just was nothing that I thought was good, right? And what I came to realize, and what I think it was important for me to realize, was that that opinion was coming from a position of privilege for having been in the project for the entire time. I didn't need a proposal process because I'd been around the project for a long time, for 2 years at that point. I didn't need the bureaucracy because people listened to me when I said things. I didn't need to understand and have community discussion around ways of implementing stuff because I had a sense of what was the right way to do things that was born of years within the project. But for new people coming into the project, they didn't have any of that. And if I wanted them to be effective contributors, if we as a community wanted them to be effective contributors, we needed a way to sort of catch them up on both all of the decisions that had been made before, and also enable them to enter into the community, to get feedback, to iterate, and ultimately to propose things that worked well. And so in retrospect, the KEP process is one of the best things that we did. And we should have done it earlier. And the reason for that is twofold. One is because it gives a very crisp explanation and examples for people of how to start engaging. So you have a good idea, or you have an idea for how you want to change Kubernetes. Well, the KEP process describes to you how you should express that idea to the community. And it's very crisp, and you don't have to have ever done it before to come and propose something. And everybody is sort of on the same footing. Whether they've been in the community for years or they're brand new to the community, they step into that process on the same footing. And then I think equally important, we now have a record. We have a design record of all of the different proposals and decisions that people have made over the last N years of the project. And that record is hugely valuable to new people who want to learn about both how we make decisions, how we design things, and then also just frankly understand why a particular decision was made the way that it was. Right? And so this thing that early on would have felt like a weighty, unnecessary burden becomes an incredibly important part of actually democratizing your project, broadening its reach, and scaling knowledge and knowledge transfer as people come and go through the project. I think another thing that's really made painfully obvious to us is that at a certain scale of project, the problems of your community are now humanity's problems. And what I mean by that is people are going to be jerks. People are going to come and express themselves in ways that are not acceptable in a community, or they're going to develop antagonistic relationships between each other, even amongst people who are otherwise quite good members of the community. They're going to develop, just as you can develop friendships in an open source communities, you can develop a nemesis in an open source community. And just like there are really great, fantastic people who donate their time selflessly to these communities, there are people who will come and attempt to suck all of the energy and all of the excitement out of these communities. And it's really, really important. I think early on, you sort of have the ability to pick and choose, and you know everybody personally. As your projects become bigger, and then to be honest, this is true of any organization, whether it's an open source community or anything else. As your organization becomes bigger, the problems of your organization, become one-to-one with the problems of humanity. And realizing that early on and getting enough structure in place to be able to deal with that is an incredibly important part of sustaining your community. And I think we've seen in several other open source communities some of the really big challenges between people and personalities that can occur and can even cause massive schisms in the communities. And we're really, really fortunate, I think, that Kubernetes has never really gone through that. Lucky, I would say, in the early days. And then it really brought to bear the importance of governance. Right? And so arguably too late, but fortunately in time, we formalized the Kubernetes governance process. We formalized things like special interest group leads. We formalized an election process for the steering committee. We had enough sort of senior people who were recognized by the community that we could bootstrap the steering committee. We had the foresight to try and make sure that that steering committee was drawn from across the industry and not drawn from any one particular company, to put things in our governing documents that would limit the influence of any one body on the Kubernetes community. All of these things, I think, have paid dividends. And while in those early days of hacking on code in GitHub, governance and steering documents and elections and bylaws may be the least important thing on your mind, and in the early days it probably is, it's really important to keep it in the back of your head, because we got to it too late. And Kubernetes, I think, as a community, was really lucky that we didn't have really bad leadership problems prior to establishing the right governance processes to deal with them. I think that the most interesting phase for me in Kubernetes came with the maturity process, right? And so once we were sort of past the hockey stick rocket ship phase, I like to say that I knew that we had become mature as a project when people started talking about RBAC and policy and all of these features that are very sort of enterprisey at some level, have to do with how do you do things at large scale in large corporations. I think as you hit the maturity process, it's important to really know what you're not. I mentioned this early on about how you should know who you are and know what your users want. I think once your community gets big enough, people are constantly going to be trying to add stuff. There's going to be an inevitable desire to grow to fill the space that you're in. And if you don't know where you stop, it becomes very difficult to control that community. And much like with the governance, it's really valuable to have that written down. Just as in all of the stages, I think it's important to have metrics and goals for what you're doing. Now I think the stability becomes the most important part. How many bugs did you fix? How many bugs did you have to fix? How many releases did you need to immediately hotfix a release onto it? When did you break backwards compatibility? These are all of the metrics that drive you in this mature phase. And a part of that is it becomes incredibly important to slow down. I think it's really, really hard because you've gone from be quick at the beginning to slow down in the mature phase. Quality, not breaking things, these are the things that people care about more than caring about features. Right? You've already won. If you've made it from the beginning and you've attracted people and you've hit the rocket ship and you've scaled your community and you've started to mature, you've won, at least for the time being. You don't have to run that fast. And in fact, people are looking to you to slow down. You see this when the Kubernetes community has gone from doing 4 releases a year to doing 3 releases a year. And frankly, we've got a lot of people who say 3 releases a year is too many. Why can't you do 1 release a year? And that sort of evolution is an incredibly important part of how the community becomes mature. I mentioned, the quality of releases, and I think this becomes, incredibly critical for, you can't have flaky tests, right? You can't have releases that break compatibility. You need to change your culture from being a culture of customer acquisition to being a culture of customer retention. And spending the time to get the details right in this mature phase is the main focus, and in fact is afforded to you by the fact that you've slowed down. I think that the final piece, and I think this is a place where the Kubernetes community really, really succeeded in its maturity, is to make room for others, right? And that means making room for projects to grow on top, focusing on things like extensibility, being really clear with your community about what you are and what you're not going to be. You no longer have to be worried about the competitor who's coming behind you. You have the freedom and the luxury to make room for other projects and other people to have an impact as well. And I think that brings me to the last piece, which is how do you know as an individual when to move on, right? And for me, this is a very personal decision. It's very obvious from my GitHub contributions to Kubernetes that I've stepped back from day-to-day programming on the Kubernetes project. It's not an easy thing to do. It wasn't an easy thing for me to do, but it was also the right thing for me to do. And frankly, if you look at the broader community, it's a pattern that's not, it's not just me, right? And I think that's incredibly important, and I think it's a really valuable sign of a mature community. Kubernetes doesn't need us Doesn't need Clayton or Tim or I landing a ton of code in it right now. It needs new voices. It needs new community members. It also needs to slow down, which just means less code in general. But it's incredibly important to know when it's time to take a step back and to focus your energies in other areas and to let other people step up and take your project forward. And in fact, you can see here that while Tim and my and Clayton's contributions have lessened over time, the overall commit velocity is lessened too, but not nearly to the same extent. And I think that shows we've managed to create a very healthy community. That doesn't mean you stop doing stuff though, right? And so for me, it was really important that I found a home in the Kubernetes community, and that home has been working on the client libraries for Kubernetes. I found a ton of opportunity and freedom and fun, frankly, in developing the Java client, the TypeScript client, and even the C client for Kubernetes, and working with a new community of people around clients and client generation. That's the end. I hope that's really been interesting to you. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak here and to take the time to listen. Unfortunately, because of time zones, I'm not available to take questions right now, but you can always hit me up on Twitter at Brendan D. Burns. And thanks again for being interested in open source, and please check out everything we're doing at Microsoft and Azure to help sustain these open source communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. That was a wonderful, wonderful session. To answer the questions, we have Ashish Sahu and Sagar Joshi from the Microsoft team. Ashish and Sagar, I would request you to take the podium, please. The question is, will you prefer to provide some standard process, like how to maintain backend of scanning tools integrated to CI/CD pipelines? Integration is one approach, but maintaining latest updates on backend is really challenging. Any solutions for that?
I mean, yeah, the problem is real, and I think before we can answer this in say 1 lines or 2 lines, I think we will have to dig really deep into it to understand that what they're doing, and what are the stuff we can do about it. So I think my advice at this point of time is that I think get in touch with us and let us help you.
Thanks a lot, Ashish. Thanks a lot, Brandon. Thanks a lot, Sagar, for joining us. This will be all for the keynote. Audience, within a minute, we will be starting with second keynote of the day. This is Open Source India 2001. Just give us a minute.